recording now. Am I recording now? Now I'm recording. Okay. So what we're going to look at is some of the election maps that we see, and I think I have it on my Google Drive actually. And the way that we kind of represent things, because this is still obviously like a geography class, you know, so I feel like sometimes we don't really talk as much about geography. So it's interesting to go through some of this stuff still. Obviously, if you didn't know, political leanings, it's a spectrum, right? There is no like this and this necessarily. There is an in-between. And even this simplifies it maybe a little bit, and definitely simplifies it probably too much, right? This is a very simplified version of what it looks like in our politics in the United States. Obviously, you have left-leaning. When you see things like the color blue, you're thinking more liberal or Democratic. When you see things like the color red, you're usually thinking more Republican or conservative. Yeah?
I have a really dumb question that goes with father.
Yes.
Okay, so when you say progressive and conservative, they're talking about like, those are time modes, like past and future, correct?
No, not necessarily. So when you think of progressive, you're thinking about the idea. Oftentimes, I would say that I would say that progressive is somewhat synonymous with the idea of moving into something, and sometimes it's synonymous with the idea of liberalism too, with progressive, the way that it's kind of thrown around, that word at least. Whether or not it's supposed to mean that, it is often used as kind of an interchangeable thing, very often. So you will see that too. If you say somebody's a progressive, usually they're sometimes, not all the times, many times they'll be thinking of, I don't know, more progressive ideas like socialized healthcare and things of that nature. Does that make sense?
So, and then you think conservative, you think like more like going back to the past.
Not always necessarily. I mean, sometimes with conservatism, it could also be like, and many times it's in a fiscal way of like, you could be fiscally conservative. You could be thinking about like conservative in the way that you would prioritize your budgets and your spending. So it's not always, and it could also be conservative in the way of like, I am conservative in the fact that I don't want to like change. I don't want to go around and make the Constitution constantly changing, right? I don't want to be around. Or maybe I have or potentially I have a more strict interpretation of the way that things are, right?
So with these two words that are like relative to time, we read right to left, we have comments left to right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we read left and right.
Yeah.
So wouldn't it make sense if Republicans, conservatives were on the left, and liberals, Democrats, progressives were on the right, because that's how we read.
I think you may need to write a research paper on this.
Why wouldn't somebody, like when they're thinking, oh, let's do blue and red, that doesn't matter. Why do they choose
I couldn't. I personally, you know, this is something that I've studied a decent amount, and I've like looked into a lot, and I've always been relatively involved in politics. You have something you want to add? Yeah.
Like I would have left. I think the left and right thing is like because of some country like the conservative and like the conservative people like on the right side.
Yeah. Maybe like far right or far left. It's just I don't know when it leans back to where it started.
Like up down then?
I couldn't tell you.
I don't get it.
I couldn't tell you. Honestly, I wish that I had the answer to that one for you. That is one that, Iris, I'll tell you what, if you can find the answer, you can let the rest of us know, I would appreciate that. All right, so if you find that, you let us know. But either way, looking at this, it's a solid question. You also have people in the middle, which are people who usually identify as moderate, which would be somebody who maybe is, they're liberal in some aspects, but they're conservative in others. I haven't gone through and compiled a list of what is conservative, what is liberal. It's a very broad kind of spectrum, right? The reason why I'm showing you this more than anything, we're not really even necessarily talking too much about what these politics mean. We're looking more at like the demographics too. So I have a list of the demographics, some exit polls, and they're not always the most accurate thing in the world, but exit polls do give us a pretty good idea of like who voted for who. Who did white men over the age of 50 vote for? Who did black women vote for? Who did people with college diplomas vote for? Things like that. So we'll take a look at that today. But this, more so than anything, is just to give you an idea that this, again, it's a spectrum, right? And you can be somewhere anywhere in between. And this also, again, is oversimplified for sure. There's a way probably more detailed spectrum that I could have put up, but this, just for the sake of this class, is what we'll roll with, okay? Taking a look at some of these electoral college maps, obviously in the 2016 election, we had Clinton and Trump, with the majority states going red, going conservative, and voting for Trump. But when people look at these maps, the big thing that many people don't take into account, and this always happens, especially even with the most previous election, the map might have even looked relatively similar to this with the most previous election, just different states here and there. Has anybody ever seen this and been like, well, how did so-and-so win? It's all red or it's all blue, right? And the reason why it gets that way is because people tend to look at this for face value and they don't dig deeper, right? It's a deeper situation. It's not just the state. The way that a lot of this stuff is organized is through congressional districts. And so you'll find that even in incredibly, conservative states, looking at our most previous election, looking at, I don't know, the way that Georgia flipped, right? Atlanta itself in inner city areas or urban areas tend to be more Democratic, tend to be more liberal in nature. Whereas rural areas tend to be less Democratic, more Republican in nature, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So what you'll see here in the next slide is just a better representation of like where people live, right? So a lot of this has to do with geography still, where people live. Sometimes people will also look at this map and they'll be like, oh, well, look at all this red, right? And still, this is a map of a Republican victory in the presidency, so don't forget that. But still, look at all of this, right? But the thing that they forget is that oftentimes, where are people mostly concentrated? In the cities, right? And many times what you'll find is that cities tend to be more what with their population? Dense, as well as what? Who lives in cities? Democrats with who? More what? Diversity, right?
Yeah.
You see a lot more diversity in cities. You have more people from all different walks of life in cities, and that means different voting patterns, okay? So you see that a lot with this too. Again, you see all these counties, but if you looked at, did anybody watch election coverage from 2020? Where they go through, I'm sure many people did, where they go through it. If you watched, I don't know, any sort of election coverage where you got the guy who's, I swear to God, I watched so much of it that I probably could have been the guy who's up there and he's just like, now wait a second, let's click on this. And then he goes in and then.
I like the SNL skit where they showed him and his arm was just stuck.
Oh, because he touched the thing too much? Yeah. Every single time it's like, let's go. He's like, well, the state is red, but let's go in here and let's see how this works, right? And every single time that he's doing that, he's going in and he's like, okay, we're looking at Texas. But if you look at areas, especially along the border of like Texas and Mexico, and then other areas where a lot of people who might be like immigrants would settle as well, in California too, you're seeing that a lot of these areas are voting Democratic, especially if you're looking at the idea of Border Patrol and all this other stuff, who would be voting for who in this whole situation, obviously in 2016. And we'll take a look at the demographics too. But you see this, right? And this also gets into the idea of different communities also settle in different areas too. This leads you into the idea of every single time that there is any sort of presidential or midterm election, you always hear the phrase thrown around, and it's all the time, they need to get the evangelical vote. They need to get the African-American vote. They need to get the Latino vote, right? You hear it all the time. Hillary Clinton lost the Latino vote, right? Or she lost the suburban vote. So we look at a lot of this stuff and we see that people tend to settle in different areas, and based on their demographics, oftentimes people tend to vote differently. And that is part of the reason why there is such a divide in the country in many ways. You can see here too, cities obviously playing a huge role, looking at population too, margin of victory as well. And again, you can have a red state or a blue state with a red or blue county. That's what we saw with Georgia. That's what we saw with, a couple other states that kind of flipped from what they were previously at. There were different counties, and usually the ones that tend to have a higher population are going to maybe bring through more votes, which then leads into a potential win of electoral college votes in that state. I know that all this stuff is genuinely pretty confusing, especially looking at the electoral college. It took me many years to get better at the idea of the electoral college, and even still, sometimes I look through it and I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. Okay, so if there are things that pop up that do confuse you, don't get discouraged. It honestly is a work in, it will take you some time to get to know some of this stuff. Honestly, it takes a lot of looking into, for real. We also had Democrats taking the House. Again, I believe this is 2016. So you can have, this is another one of those things where you can see the divide, because at the same time where you can elect a Republican president, you can also elect a majority Democrat House, right? This is the first time in a little while that we've had Democratic House, Democratic Senate, Democrat president, right? It's not like that's the way it always goes. And oftentimes it will go other ways as well. I think it's interesting more so to kind of look at some of these demographics too. I think that this would be maybe a little bit better to look at, even so than some of these maps as well. So looking at the New York Times and looking at the exit polls from the 2016 election, you see that you can find different voting, the way that voting goes based on so many different things based on these polls. So let's see, based on like your sex, based on whether or not you identify as male or female, more people voting, more males voting for Trump in this election, more females voting for Hillary Clinton. With race, 58% of whites voting for Trump in this election, and then you have 88% of black voters voting for Clinton in this election. Big difference there. Same thing with Hispanic and Latino and Asian, 65% voting for Hillary Clinton in this election, and then 29% voting for Donald Trump. Where you're going to find populations like Black, Hispanic, Latino, and Asian, where do you think you'll find them? In the cities, right? And that is why you often see those populations will tend to vote more Democratic, and it's just kind of the way it's been, right? So there are cases and there are times where presidential candidates on the Republican side or the Democratic side will concentrate on certain communities, especially, we saw it this year in like areas like Florida, right? Because they know that winning those communities over can lead to a turning point, right? And that's also part of what's going on here. Age plays a factor for sure. 18 to 29, younger people, even 30 to 44, there's more of a divide there, but 55% voting for Democratic, and then 37% voting Republican with Donald Trump there. But 65 and over, you have 45% voting with Hillary Clinton and 53% voting Trump. The in-between kind of is more so they didn't vote for either. With education, those with a postgraduate or college degree are tending more likely, at least in this election, to vote on the Democratic side with Hillary Clinton, where those with a high school or less or some college or an associate degree tended to vote with Donald Trump here. And then you can see an even more kind of stark difference here when you look at education by race, right? White college graduates, 45% for Hillary Clinton, 49% for Trump. But if you look here, white without a college degree, 28% for Hillary Clinton, 67% for Donald Trump. And then if you look through again, non-white college graduates, 71% for Clinton, 23% for Trump. And then non-white without a college degree, 75% for Clinton, 20% for Trump. It also plays a role in things like income. And obviously, there's a lot of variability in income throughout the United States. There's also a ton of variability in income in cities, in rural areas as well. Residents, right? City over 50,000, 59% voting Democratic, 35% voting Republican. Suburbs, 45% voting Democratic, 50% voting Republican. So you can see some of these demographics are like more evenly split, whereas other ones, it's like, if you're going to win some of those votes back, you're climbing up a hill to get them. For example, a small city or rural areas in those counties is significantly more Republican than it would be Democratic. And then, of course, party affiliation, you do see that, obviously. Political ideology, liberal, moderate, conservative, the things that we talked about before, this is no real surprise there. Religion plays a role, obviously. Even though we talk all the time about how there is no established religion in the United States, it doesn't mean that it doesn't play a role. The fact is that it would be very difficult for a president to run on like a platform of being atheist. It would be. Even though there's nothing to say that they can't, religion plays such a heavy role in something like evangelical voting and the religious vote, that to do that would be to significantly disadvantage yourself, especially in rural or southern areas, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, you can do it. There's nothing saying that a president can't be atheist, but the fact is that a president probably wouldn't run on that platform even if they were, right? Because you're disadvantaging yourself entirely there. And it gets even more, obviously you have differences like sexual orientation, U.S. military service. You saw more people voting Republican if they were in the military. If you were part of the LGBTQ community, you were voting more Democratic here, right? And then also things like foreign policy issues, family financial situations. This was a big thing, obviously, in the previous election, building a wall along the U.S. Border with Mexico. 10% of Democratic voters supported, 86% of Republican voters supported that. Feelings about how the federal government is working. Enthusiastic, said the Democratic Party. Satisfied, said the Democratic Party here. And then enthusiastic, 20% of the Republican Party. Satisfied, 20%. And then 77% of the Republican Party downright angry, right? And then it also gets into things like previous presidents' performance and what political affiliation that president was involved in. So overall, there's plenty of other things that we could probably talk about with this, but the main thing that I wanted you guys to get just like a really short introduction into today, because I don't know exactly how much more time we'll be spending on this. I'm sure we'll have a little bit more talk about it as well, probably something more in depth. And we do have an article that I'm going to give you guys pretty much the majority of class to work on today. But with this article, you'll go through it and taking some of the stuff that we've just talked about, you're going to answer some of the questions that are found in this article. So you guys will have the rest of class to work on this. There are 8 questions. You should be able to get it done today, but if you don't get it done today, it is due by Sunday midnight, okay? Does anybody have any questions about anything? I know I'm not talking at you for like 7 hours or anything up here, and I'm giving you more time to work, but if anybody wants to share anything too, if you have any thoughts or anything at all. Have you? I think you did last semester, actually. I think Mr. Adams told me something about you guys did talk about a little bit. So there was a point. So you have some background knowledge on this. Again, I don't know how much time exactly we're going to spend on this because I'm just kind of rolling with whatever he does. But either way, I think this is it's an interesting and important topic for all of you for many different reasons. So should be interesting to talk about. Other than that, go ahead and work on that assignment that you guys can find on the homepage of Canvas. And those of you online, that is all I really have for today. So you guys are good to go if you would like, but make sure that you do that assignment, all right? Have a good weekend.